Welcome to this edition of the Neurocrush Immersion. We have the intriguing theme of seizures and spiritual seekers. And in this episode, we're going to revisit some of the things you probably listened to in the first episode on Jiddu Krishnamurthy and his transformation. I begin by talking about some important seers in India. Sri Ramakrishna, in his biography, there is this description. It was a winter morning, and the master was sitting near the east door of his room, wrapped in his moleskin shawl. He looked at the sun and suddenly went into samadhi. His eyes stopped blinking, and he lost all consciousness of this world. After a long time, he came down to the plane of the sense world. Other episodes that are described: his dear mother Chandramani had died. Paying regard to the prestige and honor of sannyas and the spiritual injunctions connected with it, the master did not observe a saucha or perform any other rites at the death of his mother. Feeling that he had not performed any action proper for a son, one day he was about to perform tarpana. But no sooner that did he take up an anjali of water that a state of spiritual injunction came to him. His fingers became insensible and separated from one another, and all the water fell between his fingers, in spite of his repeated efforts to perform the rite. Then, with a heart laden with sorrow, he sorely pleaded with his deceased mother his utter incapacity to do it. Sri Ramakrishna is known to have had repeated mystical experiences. He is also documented to have repeated seizures or epilepsy. Let's now talk about Sri Ramana. Here's a description that appears in the books. I went to the tank in front of Pachayaman Koil for a bath, and we were returning by a shortcut when, as we approached Tortoise Rock, I felt tired and giddy, and so I sat down on the rock. Suddenly, the view of the natural scenery in front of me disappeared, and a white curtain was drawn across the line of my vision and shut out the view of nature. I could distinctly see the gradual process. At one stage, I could see part of the nature clear, and the rest was being covered by an advancing curtain. It was like drawing a slide in one's view of a stereoscope. On experiencing this, I stopped walking, lest I should fall. When it cleared, I walked on. When darkness and fainting feeling overtook me a second time, I leaned against a rock until it cleared. And again, for a third time, I felt it safer to sit, so I sat near the rock. Then the bright white curtain completely shut out my vision. My head was swimming, and my blood circulation and breathing stopped. The skin turned a livid blue. It was a regular death-like hue, and it became darker and darker. Vasudeva Shastri took me in fact to be dead, held me in his embrace, and began to weep aloud and lament my death. His body was shivering. I could at that time distinctly feel his clasp and his shivering, hear his lamentation, and understand the meaning. I also saw the discoloration of my skin and felt the stoppage of my heartbeat and respiration and the increased chillness of the extremities of my body. Yet, my usual current of self-effulgence, Atma Spurana or self-awareness, was continuing as usual in that state also. I was not afraid in the least, nor felt any sadness at the condition of my body. I had closed my eyes as soon as I sat near the rock in my usual Padmasana posture. The body, which had no circulation nor respiration, maintained that position. This state continued for 10 to 15 minutes. Then I felt a shock passing suddenly through the body. The circulation revived with enormous force, as also respiration, and there was a profuse perspiration all over the body from every pore. The color of life reappeared on the skin. Then I opened my eyes, got up casually, and said, "Let us go." This very detailed description again indicates several things. One of the things it indicates is an event that is affecting the nervous system, but where partial awareness is retained. So, what Sri Ramana says is that he knew all these things were happening to him. His skin was changing color, his extremities were becoming cold, his respiration had become labored, his heart was beating fast, but he couldn't do anything about it, and he was sort of helpless. But he could watch himself. And then he feels the shock like sensation go through him after a period of time. So intense was this experience that the person with him, Vasudeva Shastri, thought he was dying and started lamenting that he was losing his close associate, Sri Ramana. And then, after the event is over, he comes back and he is able to walk again. Again, the whole event and the way it's described indicates a neurological event, most likely a seizure. And when a seizure happens, an electrical discharge passes through your brain. It's like a little short circuit in your brain activity. And depending on which part of the brain is involved, you end up having physical symptoms as described here. Many of the symptoms described here indicate a partial seizure. Dostoevsky was one of the famous writers, one of the greatest writers of the 19th century, and he overcame a range of physical and mental problems in the pursuit of his art. His writing is characterized by interwoven psychological, religious, and existential themes. Epilepsy featured in 5 characters of his novels. Fyodor's own epilepsy became worse in captivity, and he suffered frequent fits for the rest of his life. The main features of these fits were an unusual aura described as ecstatic, followed by a generalized seizure. One of his famous novels is The Idiot, and it has as a protagonist the unforgettable Prince Mishkin, who arrives unannounced as a Christ-like figure compared by some to Don Quixote. This was Dostoevsky's most personal novel, based on several real-life events, and most notably his own epilepsy. In this, Mishkin describes an aura that finishes with an ecstatic and prayerful fusion in the highest synthesis of life. The prince, as described in the novel, is highly intelligent, humble, and empathetic, but he has an illness that makes him vulnerable. No holy fool, he loves in a platonic way, struggling with competing divine and human values, making it difficult to live in the world. Once again, if you look at what Dostoevsky keeps describing in his novels, it is a partial seizure with loss of awareness, and with that loss of awareness, there is an ecstasy that is described in certain circumstances. And this is the ecstasy which accompanies many spiritual seekers and their experiences. It is the ecstasy that is described in the life of several seers, and that really is the subject of today's Neurokrish immersion. Saint Teresa of Avila, canonized in 1622 as a saint, she was a talented writer who described the extraordinary diversity of her symptoms with great precision. Teresa was entirely devoted to adoration and prayer, seeking an indissoluble union of her soul and God, which made her a great Occidental mystic. She said she found enjoyment in God. Teresa described 3 main categories of symptom at different stages of her life. During her youth, she recollected, I saw myself more and more affected by fevers, which caused me great fainting spells. Fevers with fainting often characterize febrile seizures, seizures that come with fever, and it is a feature of youth. Indeed, it's children who suffer more with febrile seizures. She goes on to say, in 1534, the year in which she took her perpetual vows, she declared, I was at the height of my vows, but in spite of so much happiness, my life did not resist the changes of life and food. The fainting spells increased, and it took me a heartache so violent that it inspired fear. My illness was in such a degree of gravity that I was almost always on the point of fainting. Often I lost consciousness. To this was added a deep sadness. Very interestingly, fear as a symptom of partial seizures or as an aura of epilepsy is well described because fear arises from the temporal lobe and seizures often arise from the temporal lobe. She also talks about a deep sadness, and of course, the temporal lobe and the limbic system are our emotional brain, and therefore the sadness arises from the same part of the brain where the seizures arise. At 23 years of age, in 1539, Teresa experienced a severe crisis. She was considered dead for 4 days. On those 4 days of frightful crisis, I was left with torments that only can be known to God. Pouring hot liquid wax, which was poured on her eyelids, elicited no response, but she recovered after receiving the extreme unction. Her tongue was in tatters from being bitten, and she could only move a finger of the right hand. This tetraplegia, which is loss of power in all four limbs, and allodynia, last until she was 25 years old and her health remained fragile. Biting one's tongue during a bout of epilepsy is not uncommon, and severe injuries to the tongue and to other body parts do happen during seizures because people are helpless, they are having violent movements, and these includes chewing movements, and sometimes the tongue is caught between the teeth and gets bitten quite badly. But this kind of weakness, tetraplegia, following seizures, going on for a very prolonged period of time is rather unusual. During the latter period of her life, until her death in 1582, Teresa describes multiple symptoms, including episodic abdominal aura. Very many people with temporal lobe epilepsy described a sinking feeling in the pit of their stomach or other abdominal symptoms as an aura or as a warning of having a seizure. She also describes paroxysmal pain, feelings of detachment, floating feelings, and loss of consciousness with postural immobility. And of course, all these are part and parcel of having seizures. A witness reports, one day a sister entered the kitchen and she saw the Holy Mother ravished in ecstasy, her face radiant with beauty. Her feet did not touch the ground, but her right hand held the skillet in which the fish was cooking. She kept it above the fire with as much skill as if her mind had remained entirely at work. Again, during a partial seizure, a person can appear to go about their activities somewhat normally to an observer, and that's a very interesting feature of partial seizures. Teresa experienced ecstatic states, which she calls delight. She describes accurately at 47 years a mystical experience of great delights known as the cherub or the golden dart. Beside me, on the left hand, appeared an angel in bodily form, but it was our Lord's will that I should see this angel in the following way. He was very beautiful, and his face was so aflame that he appeared to be one of the highest rank of angels who seemed to be on fire. In his hands I saw a great golden spear, and at the iron tip there appeared to be a point of fire. This he plunged into my heart several times so that it penetrated into my entrails. When he pulled it out and left me utterly consumed by the great love of God, the sweetness caused by this intense pain is so extreme that one cannot possibly wish it to cease, nor is one's soul then content with anything but God. So she had this wonderfully ecstatic experience, clearly too, again, possibly part of a seizure. Let's talk now about St. Paul, who famously probably had temporal lobe epilepsy. As we know, St. Paul the Apostle was a very important part. He had Jewish origins and he became a very important part of Christ and his work. I will go on to visions and revelations. I know a man who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, in the body or out of the body. That I do not know. I simply know that in the body or out of the body, God knows which, this man was caught up to paradise and heard sacred secrets which no human lips can repeat. Of an experience like that, I am prepared to boast, he says. My wealth of visions might have puffed me up, so I was given a thorn in the flesh, an angel of Satan, to rack me and keep me from being puffed up. 3 times over, I prayed the Lord to relieve me of it, but He told me, "It's enough for you to have my grace. It is in weakness that my power is fully felt." St. Paul thus describes ecstasy, which he prized and he was prepared to boast about, a sense of unreality in relation to his body, a dreamy state allied to auditory hallucinations which are imperfectly recollected. Many studies of epilepsy have, in the same way, reported ecstatic states. William Gowers, a very famous neurologist, one of the most famous early neurologists, reported a patient with a psychic aura with an idea of being in heaven. Earl and Trimble treated a patient with clinical and EEG features of temporal lobe epilepsy with occasional grand mal or generalized seizures. Some attacks would begin with a flash of light in both eyes, followed by a psychic state of being in an intense religious experience of resounding elation when he would feel impelled to proclaim the stories of God. Of 100 patients with emotional experiences being part of epilepsy, Williams reported 9 in whom the aura was pleasurable, only the more educated being able to give good descriptions. A couple of such examples: a woman of 41 years described a sudden experience of being lifted up, of elation with satisfaction, a most pleasant thing. A man aged 32 years described a sudden feeling of extreme well-being that envelops all my senses. The room assumes vast proportions and I feel as if in another world. All these experiences have an element of what we call depersonalization, a sense of being out of one's body. St. Paul's words, "in the body, out of the body, I do not know," suggest an aura of depersonalization. In this circumstance, the subject may feel unsubstantial, not there, disembodied. He may say he sees himself outside himself. St. Paul also heard sacred secrets which no lips can repeat, suggesting an intense esoteric rapturous state associated with an elaborate auditory sensation whose details cannot be recollected. And indeed, St. Paul's stake in the flesh, which he describes as the work of Satan, may have represented the supervention of grand mal seizures having a generalized epilepsy that followed these ecstatic experiences on some occasions. Ecstatic or mystical experiences in epilepsy are therefore historical, have been described in several mystic figures of renown across cultures and are well known and talked about. What characterizes these experiences? There is an altered state of consciousness, but also there is mental clarity, expanded self-consciousness, and physical well-being. The frontiers between oneself and the environment seem to disappear, as if the self-consciousness was enlarged to include everything, and the experiencer may report feelings of revelation, clarity, or understanding the meaning of life. The experiences are therefore quite transformative. The great philosopher William James gives us certain characteristics of such experiences. He says they have to have a characteristic of ineffability, they defy expression, they need a noetic quality, there is illumination, there is revelation, there are insights into the depths of truth when one is having the experience. There is a transiency, the experience cannot be sustained for long, and there is a passivity, the mystical state feels as if the will was in abeyance. One is not really in control of what is happening. Two famous British philosophers, State and Huxley, have talked about this. State talks about a sense of unity or an experience of becoming one with all that exists. Huxley talks about an immemorial and universal substrate underlying all spiritual paths and reflected in every spiritual and religious tradition known to man. And interestingly, as I have reviewed, across multiple cultures and religions, the spiritual states seem to have extreme commonality, which is what we've been talking about. So, what then is ecstatic epilepsy? As we were talking about focal seizures are seizures where the abnormal discharges arise from one part of the brain, one part of the cerebral hemisphere. And very often there is an aura or a warning of seizure, and this is one of the early symptoms, and this itself can have many manifestations. Ecstatic feelings or mystical feelings as an aura do happen, but they are not that common. Ecstatic symptoms as part of focal epilepsy may well be grossly underrepresented, says a study by Geschwind and Picard, that unless a specific inquiry is made, feelings of embarrassment or stigma prevent many patients from reporting these experiences. Picard opines that the primum movens of these experiences are not mere positive feelings, but a feeling of certainty or clarity, as if everything seemed self-evident, completely coherent, which then gave rise to serenity and or bliss. Why ecstasy and mysticism, and what's the role of the brain in all this? We assume that there is a role for epileptic activity, that when we do an EEG, we see spike and slow waves in the EEG. Very often this arises from the temporal lobe, and sometimes we see tumors or developmental lesions when we do scans of the brain in these people. The temporal lobe, of course, is our emotional brain, and it's the seat of memory, learning, and aspects of language. Picard and others postulate that the symptomatic zone, the zone where symptoms arise, may be different from the epileptogenic zone, the zone where epilepsy starts. The insula, which is a center in the deep inside the brain, in the middle, it may have a specific role in feelings of ecstasy, as it has a role in what's called interception, the perception of the physical body in consciousness. And evidence for this has come from both depth EEG recordings as well as functional brain imaging. It has also come from electrical stimulation of various brain parts and an analysis of the experiences that happen in these circumstances. And what the authors point out is that both insulae may be involved in religious and mystical experiences. And when you stimulate on one side, the activity is transferred to the other. Recently, there was a report of a time dilation illusion following the electrical stimulation of the right mid-dorsal insular region during the functional mapping of a patient with drug-resistant epilepsy in the context of a pre-surgical evaluation. The patient described a feeling like an eternity, comparable to a feeling he experienced as a teenager while tripping with LSD and mushrooms, which could correspond, in our opinion, to an ecstatic or a mystical experience. Interestingly, the involvement of the insula could also be shown during a mystical experience related to an Ayashua session. This is a plant-based psychedelic drug which is brewed into a tea or into a concentrated liquid to drink, and there is a whole in Peru there is a whole ritual of drinking it. And when this was being studied, what they found was that the blood perfusion to the bilateral anterior insula using SPECT there was an increase in the blood perfusion, a change in the blood perfusion. So clearly, these mystical experiences do localize to that part of the brain called the insula. In summary, therefore, mystical experiences are reported from every culture. They are part of the evolution of many seers and spiritual seekers. Mystical experiences may have their basis both in brain activity, as in epilepsy, and in brain regions, the temporal lobe and insula in particular. And of course, you don't have to have epilepsy in order to have a mystical experience. A mystical experience can, however, involve the insula and be triggered by various other things, including psychedelic substances. Mystical experiences, as we have detailed here, appear to have unique qualities: an altered reality, a sense of disconnection from the environment, a sense of oneness with it, and perhaps most importantly, a sense of clarity and positive feelings. For all the aforementioned reasons, ecstatic and mystical experiences can be life changing, especially when not brought about by psychedelic substances. I was inspired to explore this topic thanks to reading a very scholarly book, Two Saints by Arun Shourie. I strongly recommend it to those of you listening to the podcast. It's a great read, if a little scholarly and detailed. And if you're interested, do listen also to the Neurokrishna immersion on the transformation of Jiddu Krishnamurthy. And you will, through that, understand the mystical experience and the evolution of a mystical experience in one person who went on to become a great seer. Thank you for listening. And if you're someone who would like to watch some of these slides and you'd like to see images of the insula, please do follow the video version of this podcast because it has a slide guide. Thank you.